Hey everyone, Mark and Steve here.
Before we get started today, we want to let you know about Dare to Connect, our new online interactive video platform.
For less than the cost of a therapy session, you and your spouse get live access to both of us 3 times a week.
Each 30-minute live group support session provides interactive mentoring and healing for addicts, spouses, and couples.
If you're loving our podcast and our unique style of bringing you recovery, you're going to love Dare to Connect.
To learn more, go to daretoconnectnow.com. We're looking forward to seeing and working with you. Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast. Hello and good afternoon, good morning, wherever this finds you at. Welcome to the PBSC podcast. This is Steve Moore and Mark Castleman's with me. We're here happy to be with you guys today. We're jumping into episode 128 here on the podcast, part 2 of the abuse cycle. Last week, if many of you recall, we talked all about the abuse cycle as it applies to the addict side of a partnership, right? How this relates to addiction, how it ties in, how it kind of sets the stage for addiction. And this week we wanted to shift gears and apply that same concept, the 4 steps of the abuse cycle, and how it relates to and how it ties in with trauma, both in the relationship as well as the origins that it likely has for many of you spouses in past relationships, both romantic and non. So we're going to jump into all that today. And like we said last week, this is definitely not our cheeriest podcast. We do some more happy ones. This will be a little less so, but we're grateful to be talking about the topic. It's not everyone's favorite, but it is necessary. And it's important to be aware of this stuff as you navigate this process because, trauma, betrayal, obviously these are the things that we target in this. But when we look at the real roots behind betrayal trauma, what really, is kind of, I guess, the fire behind a lot of the responses that we have when in a place of trauma. And as we try to navigate the healing process, the origins of this stuff, especially as it centers around abuse, past and present, is really critical to that discussion. So we're going to jump right into that.
Yeah. It's really, when we're in a relationship, we have one partner or spouse who is suffering with addiction. The other is in betrayal trauma. Without understanding the full scope of the impact of abuse, especially past abuse and history, it can put a big damper on us trying to heal ourselves as well as heal the relationship if we don't understand the impact of all of these things. Mm-hmm. But it can seem it's just my relationship right now. And if the full focus is upon that, a lot of what's going on remains unaddressed, unrevealed. And it's enormously helpful to see the scope of where a lot of this, the origins of a lot of this, are enormously helpful, especially as we talk to spouses and partners in your healing process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of information to cover here today. As always, we know that this will be kind of scratching the surface a little bit today. So we appreciate you kind of hanging in here with us. These podcasts are relatively short. We'd love to, as many of you are familiar with, we do run a program that offers a more extended interactive, I guess, version you could say of this called Dare to Connect. We meet with our addicts, spouses, and couples 3 times a week, one for each of those groups, and are able to really get interactive with you. We're able to ask questions. We're able to give you answers. We would love for those of you who haven't yet joined us over there, we'd love to see you over there. Please feel free to give that a try. We are continuing our current 2-week free trial of that. You can find more info about that at daretoconnectnow.com. But with all that said, let's jump right into this and let's really get through some of the main points of what this looks like and the things to be aware of. So with that said, let's talk about past abuse and trauma in prior relationships. Okay. That may sound a little odd for some of those who are listening, because we're obviously here focusing on, how do we fix our marriage today? How do we work on addiction? How do we find healing here and now? But the reality is that for many trauma victims, a big part of their story, a big part of the origins of that abuse, as tragic as that emotional abuse or other forms of abuse, sadly, are in one's current relationship. For many, and I would probably say the majority of the clients that I work with, those sadly have origins in past romantic and non-romantic relationships, right? They have strong ties to for a couple of different reasons, to these other relationships that were around or existed well before our current spouse or partner ever came on the scene. So let's talk about a couple of those examples. So, for example, in former relationships, we learn about a lot of the rules, quote unquote, the rules for connection, right? In how we navigate current relationships. Family systems is a whole theoretical theory that we oftentimes use in the therapy world to kind of talk about the different roles, among other things, the different roles that people take on in a family unit. And many of us, Mark and I were talking about the program here, and Mark was talking about, for example, for him, he very much was a quote unquote scapegoat in the family, right? He was the guy that was kind of the fixer of sorts. He was both the cause as well as the salve for problems and issues in the family. I myself was I found myself being the black sheep. That was very much my role. I was kind of the cause of all problems. I wasn't a solver. I was just a cause. And when we take on or adopt these different family systems or these different roles, whether it's in a romantic or non-relationship, once we find ourselves getting into those grooves for different reasons, whether there was an absence of support in the home, or we needed to fulfill a role that others in the family, for example, parents, weren't fulfilling. So, for example, like a caretaker or the peacemaker or what have you, when we learn those roles and we become adept at those roles, oftentimes we will take over both healthy, but in many cases unhealthy elements from those relationships and the way we related in those dynamics. And we will perpetuate those in current relationships, which unfortunately will set some of the stage for a lot of the abuse and the trauma that sometimes can take root.
Yeah, and this was really the case, for example, in my marriage, early on and in the mid years of my marriage, I brought a lot of baggage from that family system. Mm. And my wife, for example, my wife and I would get into a disagreement, and I would very quickly go to the place of, we're getting divorced. Yeah. We're getting divorced. And she was shocked. She's like, well, wait, we're just having a disagreement. Why are you thinking we're getting divorced? And it was because of the intensity of my family experience, where everything erupted into World War III so quickly. And I learned to be gun shy. It's kind of like you've had this sore on your arm ripped off, 27 times. And now just a little impact on that sore that would normally on a healthy arm wouldn't even elicit hardly noticing it. And now you get it tapped. You're like, oh, right. And so I developed this hypervigilance. I developed this deep sensitivity to the slightest sign that something was off or that there was danger looming on the horizon or whatever it was. I was very sensitive to that. And my wife was pretty shocked by how quickly I would catastrophize and, go to this place of, defensiveness and throwing up walls and just all of these things. That was the family system that I was raised in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and while we're talking about the family system, because you're bringing up a couple of great points, Mark, there's the, if we look at some of the other sources for maybe some of these roles that we find ourselves in, sometimes there are also sources outside of relationships. Right. Oftentimes cultural traditions, religious traditions, right, can set the stage for some of these things as well.
Yeah. Religious traditions, how I interacted with my peers, dating relationships that I had that were dysfunctional. For example, one of the things that I was surrounded with as I was, a kid and in my teen and even young adult years, for example, was being surrounded by people who gaslighted. Gaslighting was a big strategy used by people in my life.
You want to describe that real quick, Mark?
So gaslighting. So you're the one at fault. You're the one who's got all these issues. And what you do is you learn to deflect and displace those issues onto others and convince them that they are the problem. This is you. You're the one that's insane. You're the one that's always losing your temper or all these things. It's not me, it's you.
Yeah.
And these people become expert at convincing you that something's wrong with you, not them. And here's the crazy part. I had all these gaslighters that sort of were role models, I guess, in a twisted way, role models or the ones who mentored me. And I became myself a great gaslighter because I was so insecure and so had no tolerance for anyone to point out any of my issues or my character defects or my downfalls. And so I was expert at deflecting so that people were convinced that suddenly they were the problem instead of Mark.
Yeah.
But I learned that. And then I used it later in relationships as a way to quote, protect myself. Right.
Yeah. Well, and what you're saying kind of ties right into our next point, and this is why prior relationships are so important to take into account when focusing on the present. Trauma, I guess one way of putting this is that trauma, quote unquote, echoes, right? From one relationship to another.
Yep.
The brain does not, the trauma response, as we talk about often on this program, is what we would, we're a very God-oriented program in here. We would argue it's a God-given response. Sometimes we look at it as such, we use it almost like a dirty word in recovery, but the trauma response is not a bad thing. It helps to protect us when things are unsafe, right? It's when it goes haywire or starts to be triggered when it shouldn't be that it becomes problematic or it starts to rule our life in different ways.
Or we've said it becomes hyper sensitive, right?
Yes.
You just have you've dialed it in so that you hardly have any resiliency against anything because it's been so intense in your past.
Yeah, there's been like a real hyper aversion to a certain thing, kind of like what Mark was saying. I can relate very much to what Mark was saying in a different way. I learned my trauma taught me early on not to get close to people because they leave you when you do.
Yes.
Right. In my case, it was they physically leave, like they literally die and they go away. And so you can't get close to people, but much of the same response. And I would have similar responses to what Mark is describing, right? I would go to code red and there was any sort of a conflict, and not just in my marriage, to be fair, with other people too, right? It was if somebody approached me about something, there wasn't a room for civil discussion. It was, we're going to have a street fight, right? Like we're going to duke this out right here. There wasn't such a thing of, can we work this out? It was very much, okay, well, immediate abandonment, immediate response. And, that echoing, when you experience these different things, right, we develop these sensitivities that in turn, and this is the key, will oftentimes amplify our response in the present.
Yes.
Right. When the brain senses that what is happening right now hits on, we call them trauma chains, right, from my past or situations that, the brain is reminded of as before, that will greatly amplify that trauma response, right? Subconsciously, the brain is saying, holy crap, this is just like when you were 10, right? This is just like when you were 10. Remember, this isn't safe, right? And so we have these greatly amplified responses that are much more hair trigger, if you will.
Yes.
Right. Than would be otherwise. And oftentimes the responses are much more extreme as well.
And again, all of that out of a very natural, built-in, often healthy thing that says, I've got to protect myself from being hurt again. I'm wiser because I've already been through this. I'm not going to let this happen to me again. So that response is all good, but it easily becomes exaggerated. It easily becomes hypervigilant. It easily becomes hair trigger, right? It's tough to navigate when there's all this past trauma and abuse.
Now, the path to healing these things is very similar to what is similar to navigating and working on current stuff. And so we're going to talk about that as well here in a minute. But it is just something to be aware of, right? The reality is that for every spouse in this process, there will be certain triggers for you that will set you off quicker than anything, far more so than other women in your group, right? Yeah. Or other partners that you're aware of. And for a lot of addict spouses, this will sometimes be very mystifying to them. I have worked with more than one coupleship. I'll give you just a generalized example. It's very common for couples to begin therapy with me because they've been engaging in sex in some way he for the addict partner, for example, will say something or do something during the experience that is seemingly innocuous to him, but for her, for whatever reason, because of her past or maybe past issues or trauma or things that he has even done before, right, will become triggering. And it takes that experience and immediately shuts it down and turns it into a hugely traumatizing event.
Right.
And they will just be, and the spouse will find themselves just completely dumbfounded. Like, what did I do? What happened? What happened? Right. And the poor partner is left there feeling just, incredibly unsafe, incredibly triggered. And then, that's oftentimes how that will come out. So being aware of that and kind of taking note of that sometimes can kind of help to explain for a lot of the partners that we work with, some of that seeming insanity sometimes they feel inside themselves, where it's like, why did I respond that way? Right? Where did that come from? What is that about? So anyway, we'll just kind of keep that in the back of your pocket as we go through this. We really ought to jump into, for sake of time here, let's talk a little bit. We're just going to briefly review what we talked about more in depth last week, which is the abuse cycle, okay, in a current relationship and what to be looking out for. There are 4 main steps that most experts agree kind of accompany this. There's the tension building phase, which is where the pressure is kind of building. Okay, you can kind of feel it on the horizon. A lot of partners, and as on both sides of the fence, can feel it, right? There's kind of a pulling away. It's that anticipatory response of, oh shoot, something's coming, right? That tension building place will eventually, and oftentimes in a way, ironically, will cause and lead to the explosion, right? The incident or series of incidents where the abuse takes place, the emotional and tragically so physical or sexual abuse or other types of abuse, right, will occur following that event or series of events, unless the pattern is broken in any one of these stages. That's oftentimes where reconciliation will occur. The quote unquote abuser will put out massive accolades and promises. I call them blood oaths, right? I'm so sorry. It was so awful. I'm going to be different in these 100 ways. It's going to change right now, right? There will be almost an act of desperation oftentimes on the part of the abuser, right? To navigate or get back to a healthy place. A partner oftentimes is responsive to that for a variety of reasons, whether it's healthy or not. And
yeah,
so that
and some couples will find what they interpret after the big blow up incident and abuse occurs, that in that reconciliation, that coming back together, they even consider that to be huge connection, right? Yeah. Because it's in contrast to the abuse and the trauma and the separation, the disconnection. Now, a lot of clients I work with, and I was raised this way. It's we made up. We came back and we made up. Mm-hmm. And some people actually find that they look forward to that. Sometimes they'll even engage in the blow up so they can have the coming back together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. Because that reconciliation stage combined with the last stage in the cycle, which is the calm stage, very much has almost kind of a honeymoon, almost emotionally kind of a narcotic effect.
Yes.
Right? When we're pulled into the codependency inherent in this kind of a cycle, there is a huge euphoric effect when there's that resolution component.
Yeah. I've actually had couples where they said we felt like we were getting in fights on purpose so we could make up.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The highs and the lows of that can't be understated for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that looks like a lot of different things, but just to be kind of aware, if one of those litmus tests, if you're wondering if you're finding yourself in that place, it's very, very common in this addiction recovery process, especially pre-recovery, for there to be not just one, but sometimes multiple cycles going on, including an abusive cycle.
Right.
Emotionally, for example, you could look at the addiction cycle, if it's not being handled correctly, as an emotionally abusive cycle. If I continue to hurt my partner as an addict, right, and I keep doing the same things that I've always done before, I end up with the same things that I'm always going to get, right? If I'm giving half-ass efforts into recovery, but not really accessing the tools that I need or not making the efforts to change, right? What do? I make these well-intended promises of, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And oftentimes those are honest, right? I'm going to change. I'm going to do it better. I'm going to whatever. But without tools and without doing anything different, what happens? I just end up doing the same thing eventually. We go through the same process, right? There's that devastation. There's that, tension component to it. There's this reconciliation piece. Things get better. And then we kind of move back. So emotionally, you can see how that can almost mimic that cycle. And in some ways is actually abusive in and of itself, because for most addicts, leading up to the acting out or accompanying the acting out is all of that emotional reactivity, right, that accompanies it. And so this is pretty much, I would say, in more cases, not present in an unregulated, non-recovery household, right, where that isn't happening.
Yes.
So,
so be aware of that abuse cycle and recognize it when you're in it, and so let's talk a little bit more about what this, trauma brings for the spouse of an addict, someone who's in betrayal trauma and trying to be in healing. One of the things I've noticed is, I noticed this in my own life and working with others, trauma can easily become the expert in our lives.
Absolutely.
Right? Where trauma informs us about so many things. And that can be good, right? Again, I start to become more sensitive to and recognize trauma for what it is, which hopefully helps me to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, to hold my ground, right? If I see the abuse cycle beginning, I interrupt, I step in and say, we're not doing this again, right? So trauma as the expert can be healthy, but then there's, of course, an unhealthy side to that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The other side to that would be, right, when trauma becomes the obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, if we talk about, kind of going back to Mark's point before we jump off of it, right, when trauma is an expert in our lives, when it's dictating or it is saying this is what reality is, what does that look like? Most commonly, it oftentimes will look like mind reading, right? Our trauma response will oftentimes say, this is what this other person is thinking, or this is what they're intending, right? Or this is what this means, or this behavior means, right? And it becomes that overriding expert as opposed to being just a cautionary component.
Right.
Where it should be saying, hey, this has happened before, right? This could be dangerous. This could be whatever. You need to take a look at this. It oversteps that boundary of being informant and turns into a, nope, this is exactly what's going on. Right.
And I see this a lot. I see this a lot with spouses I work with who are healing from their betrayal trauma, where they become hypervigilant. Any little sign that they notice that could be the slightest hint that the addict's past behavior is returning, even the slightest little sign of that, they find themselves jumping on it immediately and often reacting in a pretty extreme way. And then what happens is the addict in recovery starts to feel like he's under the microscope, and that everything he does or doesn't do is going to erupt. Mm-hmm. So you get both spouses on edge, both spouses walking on eggshells, yes. Right? Where trauma becomes the overriding expert, the overriding factor in everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And so, trauma can easily become a help for us, but it can also become that obstacle, right? And hold us back, because as long as trauma is the complete expert, right? As long as we're living in our trauma, it will help to keep us, I guess, quote unquote, safe to a degree, but it also has there's a critical issue with it. It also keeps any forward momentum from happening either.
Exactly.
Right. It keeps us locked in our emotional bunker, so to speak. And so moving
you find
forward,
yourself in that place, right? How do you begin to move through that and become healthy?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of different ways, right? Obviously, there's the whole, we won't talk about this for sake of time. We would reference you to any of our other podcast episodes for this, but that involves the step number one on the outside piece of what you can't control is the addict partner working on their recovery, developing out trust, working on communication, developing out skill sets around reactivity and providing a safe space for you and all the other stuff that we talk about. So we'll set that whole piece aside. So there's that work to be done. But as far as the own internal work goes, right, going back to what we started with here, this trauma response, this trauma that so many spouses carry is very complex and has a lot of deep roots.
Yes.
And so a lot of really great ways to tackle it would be, for example, EMDR style therapy, lifespan integration, which is I guess you could call it a distant cousin to EMDR. Other types of traditional therapy can be helpful with that. You can learn lots of different skill sets. So for example, learning how to state your needs or to find your voice. A lot of the partners that we work with, because of current dynamics in their current relationship, but also past relationships, including that cultural piece that we talked about, have not felt as though they've even had permission or have been safe enough to have their voice and to state their own needs. Right? For many trauma victims, it's very common, when you get accustomed to doing damage control in different relationships, and then you get into a relationship where there are a lot of problems and issues, it's very easy to continue assuming that same role, right? So many of the spouses that I work with sadly find themselves in that damage control state. They're trying to keep everything together, the kids together, protect them from their husband who's volatile, try to make sure that the husband's happy all the time so he's not reacting, right? And what gets lost in there among so many other things? One's own voice, one's own needs, right? What do I even want my life to look like? So many trauma victims spend so much time simply trying to keep the peace. They're never able to invest in where do I actually want to go.
Right. Yep. Learning to stand up for yourself, learning to recognize that when you go along to get along, you give pieces of yourself away in that process, right? Absolutely. Just trying to keep things even and peaceful. And because you don't want more trauma, I don't want more pain. So it's my job to make sure that this just all stays on an even keel. Yes. And you lose yourself in that. And so a couple ways to come out of that place is, one, get an outside support system that's not dependent on your marriage or partnership.
It should actually be separate from your marriage and partnership.
Right. Find, for example, other women who have been where you are. They're further down the healing path so that they can provide feedback, right? Kind of an objective feedback. They've learned to slow things down. They can help you to step back and take a look at it because they've been there. They're not in the immediacy of trauma right now. So find a support system that has those people that are they're longer down the path. They have more wisdom, more experience. You need those people to bounce stuff off of, to get validation from. Hey, I feel what you're going through. You're absolutely, I know where this is at. Let me tell you what I've been through. Let me give you some hope of what to look forward to. Right? Very important to have that outside support system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Next piece to this, and again, we have whole podcasts on this, so we'll reference you there. We can't emphasize this enough. Boundaries. Okay. There are boundaries fulfill so many roles in the recovery process for both the addict, the spouse, and the couple. But for those of you who find yourself really deep in trauma, for those of you who find yourself really struggling to vocalize needs, especially in the moment, because oftentimes that's where trauma victims lose their voice the most, right? Is in the moment when the heat is on or whatever. Boundaries, among whatever else they can become, we talk about this in therapy all the time, it can become sustainable replacements to fill the gap that the trauma response provides. Yeah. Right? The trauma response pulls us out, says unsafe. So we distance, we isolate, we do all these things. And much like anger, both anger and trauma, they hold one thing in common. They help to create space and distance, but they take tremendous amounts of energy to keep up and employ, and they come at a lot of toxic cost. Boundaries are what we put in place of that, right? They're the safeguards that we design to one, protect and to mitigate against further trauma responses that are unnecessarily triggered. So, boundaries, for example, with the spouse, or even with one's own recovery. But then they also are the gateway to setting the template for what the needs are going forward. So not just the taking of the space, but also, how does this relationship, how does the way I conduct myself, how does my own recovery, how does it need to shift or change going forward?
Yeah. How do I start to develop healthy coping mechanisms?
Yes.
And put those in place of my old automatic trauma responses, right? We talk about, taking space, taking a break, how to fill your own bucket, right? Mm-hmm. Your trauma creates an emotional bucket with holes in it that it just keeps draining away. How can you learn to fill those holes in healthy ways so that you can be filled, right? All of these, go and do a search in our PBSE podcast, use the search term boundaries, and you'll see lots of episodes.
Yes, we've talked about this many times. And the reason and the ways in which they can be used. But that's kind of the overview piece, guys, and how that kind of integrates with the cycle. We hope that there's so much more obviously to say about this. Again, we'd love to have you join us on our Dare to Connect program. We simply cannot cover either interactive wise, obviously this being a podcast, or just time wise, all that we would want to. So consider taking your recovery to that next level. Come join us over there. We'd love to have you. But we hope that this has been helpful and provides a base. Please do find that hope and healing. We so honor you spouses who listen to this podcast. We got a submission from somebody this morning that really rings true. They said, I'm really grateful for your podcast, even though I hate that I need it.
Right.
Which we know that most of you probably find yourself in that place. So we thank you for being willing to do this work and to shoulder part of a burden that you had no place in asking for, both in this relationship and with past. So,
yeah. All right. All the best, everyone. Thanks for being with us. And we look forward to picking things back up on our next episode.
Have a great week, everybody.
Everything expressed on the PBSC podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.